Is Kentucky just destined for the middle of the SEC? Chris Gordy, Locked On SEC, joining me to discuss. Let's start right there, Chris. This has been a really solid program over the last several years. They should be solid again, but are they ever going to be more than solid?
Well, I mean, the reality is this is a program that, very few people cared about. I happen to be married to a Kentucky grad, and, for years it was about, okay, we get excited for football season. After a couple losses, it's turn the page and on to basketball season. And that's kind of how it was for a long time until, 2018, Mark Stoops kind of takes them from 7-6, 7-6 to 10-3. And I go, whoa, a 10-win season at Kentucky. We didn't think that was possible. And then, he has an 8-win season. COVID, you'll leave that one out. But then another 10-win season in 2021 and 4 straight bowl appearances. That's an accomplishment for Kentucky. And so, it's kind of, they've raised the standard there, but really the standard was if we're winning any games, we're excited, because that's how bad things have gotten under Joker Phillips. And, just the program had really bottomed out. So Mark Stoops really did a good job of making them relevant again. But, high hopes when you have your second 10-win season, expectations elevate. And these last 2 seasons have been, frankly, disappointing to go 7-6 with Will Levis, who came back for a second year, and then to have this past year with Devin Leary coming in, through the transfer portal. They were good, not great. And so that's what kind of led to these mediocre seasons. Now they still, again, like we said, got to bowl games, and that's an accomplishment within itself at Kentucky. But, are they ever going to be better than the 7 or 8 win season again? Can they get to that 10-win mark? And that's what people are hoping Brock Vandagriff will bring to this year.
I think it's a difficult proposition when you introduce Oklahoma and Texas into the mix. I think the big programs like having Texas and Oklahoma there because it's high-profile games, raise the standard in the conference. We can lose another game and still get into the playoff or pick up another high-quality win. I think programs like Kentucky or a team they play in week 2, South Carolina, are looking at Texas and Oklahoma and going, well, now we got to try and contend with that. Like, we were already having a hard enough time. It's not as if we can't do it, but now it's going to be just that much tougher because you have 2 programs in there that are going to expect to win, that are going to recruit at a high level, that are going to win games, and their fan bases will demand that they win, anywhere from 9 to 11 or 12 games in a given season. I worry about Kentucky because of what you said. Last 2 years, really, really high-end quarterbacks at the college level, whether you're talking more physical traits with Will Levis or Devin Leary, I think was one of the more highly sought-after transfers in the quarterback transfer cycle this past year. And it was just kind of like, it was fine. It wasn't bad, but it was just okay. So you then go to a guy who has attempted fewer than 25 passes in his career, Chris. That doesn't instill me with a lot of confidence in the Wildcats.
Yeah, well, and not only that, but you got to consider a guy who was, that they went out 2 seasons ago. They lose to Vanderbilt, and it was a tough loss for them. That was the weird stretch where Vanderbilt upset Anthony Richardson in Florida, who, by the way, Anthony Richardson goes, top 5 in the draft. But they also beat Kentucky that year. And there was a little running back named Ray Davis, who was a top 5 rusher at Vanderbilt. And Mark Stoops said, let's go get him. We need a feature back. They bring in Ray Davis to Kentucky, and he was a top 5 rusher in the SEC last year. Was highly productive, ended up getting drafted and all that. But they got to replace that production. I mean, they've had a nice run of running backs here at Kentucky. Benny Snell was very good. And, obviously with what Ray Davis did. So now they got to replace that. But they do have 2 of the better wide receivers in the entire SEC. Dane Key and Berrien Brown are both back, and they've been very productive wide receivers. Dane Key with over 600 yards and 6 touchdowns last year. Berrien Brown, dynamic return man on top of the 500 yards receiving he had. So, they're going to have weapons for Brock Vandagriff to throw the football to. It's just a matter of, okay, can we replace running back? The O-line is back and very good. Eli Cox is back for like his 6th year at center. They bring in Marcus Cox through the transfer portal. Dylan Ray, Jagger Burton's back. So it's a very seasoned, veteran-led offensive line, and that's going to be the strength. And then, defense is always pretty strong under Mark Stoops. That's his forte. And since he's been there, they've had a really, really strong defense, and it's led by Deion Walker, J.J. Weaver, a lot of these guys back on the D-line, Octavius Oxendine. So, I'm excited to see what they do. The schedule is pretty unforgiving. I mean, it doesn't allow for a lot of room for error, but, there were people that were saying, in the shadow of Carson Beck, that Brock Vandagriff was doing a really good job of learning and developing these last couple of years at Georgia on that depth chart. And so if Brock Vandagriff can live up to the hype, not saying he's going to be Carson Beck, because we all expect Carson Beck to be one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC this year. But if Vandagriff can be better than Leary was last year, I think Kentucky is primed to pull off an upset or two.
I think there is a solid foundation for Vandagriff to succeed, and it might just come down to him. It might just come down to how well do you adapt to the college game? How can you overcome, what essentially are going to be freshman mistakes, because he hasn't logged a heck of a lot of snaps. I think the front of this schedule is far more forgiving than the back end. I mean, there's Georgia in there, but the first 5 of the first 6 games are going to be played in Lexington for the Wildcats here. You have to think that that's a comfortable way for a guy who doesn't have really any starting experience or playing experience to work his way into college football. Southern Miss week 1 shouldn't have a problem. South Carolina week 2, I think that's the game where we're going to learn, because there's some pressure under Shane Beamer and that Gamecock staff to have a bounce back year. So I think that's a big game for both of these teams. But you're going to have plenty of urgency from South Carolina there. If Vandagriff looks good in that game, Chris, I think that's going to be a really good early season marker, because Southern Miss, how much can you really learn? Yeah, you can have takeaways, but can you draw conclusions? Probably not. Go up against South Carolina, and if he goes for 283 touchdowns and 1 interception and they win the game, I think that'll instill a lot of confidence in what Kentucky can do the rest of their season.
Yeah, and last year notwithstanding, I mean, Georgia was really good last year, and they put up 51 points on Kentucky. But prior to that, Kentucky's defenses were probably giving Georgia's the most fits of any team in the SEC. When you go look at points allowed, in 19 they held them to 21, in 20 they held them to 14, and 22 they held them to just 16 points. So Kentucky's defense, I don't know why, they just did a really good job against Georgia offensively. And yeah, you mentioned, I mean, all 3 of these games are at home for Kentucky at Kroger Field. The South Carolina game's already been announced as an afternoon game. But look, I look at Lenore Sellers coming in. They have high hopes for him at South Carolina, but he's a dual threat quarterback, but still no offensive line. That was the biggest problem with Spencer Rattler the last 2 years. They couldn't protect for him. So, and they also don't have any weapons for him either. They lost Juice Wells. They lost Xavier Legette. So, I think that's a game that Kentucky can and should win in week 2. And you go into that Georgia game feeling like, yeah, we're underdogs. We're not supposed to win. But it's a night game at Kroger Field. The Kentucky fans are going to be fired up for that. And again, if the defense is playing lights out and they force a couple turnovers, we know Georgia's loaded, but who knows? You get a couple turnovers, maybe they can keep that one close and pull off an upset. But the good news is you get it out of the way, then you get Ohio, then you're at Ole Miss, and then you're home for Vanderbilt. I know everybody has high hopes for Ole Miss, but we don't know until we see it. Lane Kiffin has been great at playing with no expectations. What does Lane Kiffin do when he has expectations now at Ole Miss and everybody's expecting to be a playoff team? So I do think the home slate is doable. You get home games against Auburn and Louisville, obviously that rivalry game, but the road trips, I mean, like we said, at Ole Miss, at Florida, at Tennessee, and at Texas, those are all tough. But I will say, though, you mentioned Texas and Oklahoma coming in. Texas, this is their first experience of the grind of an SEC schedule. And they get Florida home, then they're at Arkansas, then they get home against Kentucky before they go to A&M. This is one of those classic kind of trap games. I know it's at the end of the year, but maybe that's the game that Texas is caught going, we got Kentucky, no big deal. We're focused on the Aggies next week. That's where the SEC catches you off guard and pulls off an upset or two. Like I said, it happened to Kentucky 2 years ago against Vandy late. So, we'll see as the season gets going, but there's no doubt they have one of the tougher schedules, particularly road games in the conference. And so that's where I say if they can weather the storm, and I think 7-5 is probably the most realistic for Kentucky this year if everything goes well.
I think when you look at this schedule, between Georgia, Ole Miss, Tennessee, and Texas, only one of those games will be played in Lexington. If you win one of those games, as a furry feline friend makes a brief appearance here on the show for those watching on YouTube, if you find a way to win one of those games, I think that's surpassing expectations, because they'll be a pretty big dog, I think, in all of those contests. Chris Gordy, Locked On SEC. Check him out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. Chris, thanks as always.
Thanks, Spencer.
We've got a playoff schedule in this 12-team era. We'll talk about that next. This episode is brought to you by our friends at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers.